Okay, great. Thanks for everyone who's joined us so far after lunch. I'm sure we'll have a few people trickling in as we kick off. I'm Jon from Geotree. I'm the CEO. At Geotree, we are a carbon project analytics company, so we provide MRV services, but also for many project developers and people who fund project developers, we do due diligence as well. So looking at historical land use, calculating the carbon potential of a project, looking at risk of non-permanence, so de-risking the projects early on. That's a lot of the work that we do. I'm joined here by Anil from Cambridge University. And yeah, Anil, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Jon. I'm Anil Madhavapeddy. I'm a professor in computer science at the University of Cambridge. And I thought it might be worth actually explaining why a professor of computer science is here at a forestry conference. The whole journey began about 3 years ago in the pandemic. And at the university, we wanted to begin a process of offsetting our necessary emissions. So the university signed up to some very aggressive targets for decarbonizing, and obviously there's a number of residual emissions left. And at that time, we wanted to make sure that we did the right thing. We wanted to engage with the VCM and to find the best quality projects that we could in order to make sure that we could not only make a good impact on our carbon emissions via offsetting, but also have positive co-benefits for biodiversity, local livelihoods, and generally work on nature-based solutions as well. Because obviously a lot of the scientific body at Cambridge works in conservation over the decades, and we wanted to make sure that the value for money for these offset investments was as strong as possible. But then, when it came to actually selecting the projects, everything at the university has to happen through peer-reviewed committees, and so we pulled together something called the Cambridge Offset Working Group, and we appointed a bunch of conservation specialists at trying to do portfolio identification. And some big shortcomings in terms of how a university could make robust selections started to come to light. In particular, in the very beginning, it's just very hard for us to figure out exactly what the source data was if we wanted to independently re-verify certain aspects of the project. And so we started digging a little bit more into each of the individual projects and trying to learn and really kind of immerse ourselves in these projects, which often we had academics working on in a research capacity, but never before looking and assessing as to the details of these projects. And then lots and lots of pieces and questions started coming together. And so we built a portfolio of all of these projects and started an independent reassessment just to see if we could come up with interesting data that matched a lot of the project description documents that we were given by the various projects. And at a high level, the biggest problem was the lack of comparability between these projects. So because they all use different baselines for their assessments over the years when they were created, it was really, really hard to ascribe why a project would cost a certain amount of money and then why another project in the portfolio would be different. And so we started coming up with quantified metrics for how we might assess these projects and try to put them in such a way that we could have a single table that would describe all of the different properties in such a way that we can compare the value for money for investing in one versus the other. And then at the same time, not everything could be quantified, obviously. So there's lots and lots of co-benefits that we wanted to measure, and we had to make sure that for every individual project that we checked the aspects of biodiversity, of local livelihoods, and the justice frameworks involved in those projects to make sure that if there was a reversal in one of the projects, it wouldn't be a reputational risk reversal for the university. And of course, beyond reputation, we simply did not want to invest in projects that had questionable ethical standards, not meeting the baselines that we would establish as an institution. And so over the years, we've been working on 3 specific things in terms of quantifying the metrics involved. Looking into modern econometric-based mechanisms for calculating additionality of projects using satellite-based remote sensing. And then secondly, trying to calculate the effects of leakage, not only locally, but also in the global markets, by following supply chains and various other mechanisms to help figure out what's going on with negative externalities. And then finally, and possibly the most important thing, is figuring out how to engage with impermanence. So all of these nature-based solutions, when put in our portfolio and put up against geologically sequestered carbon removal projects, had to somehow form an equivalence basis over there. And then, for the things that we couldn't, at the moment, quantify accurately. We picked ratings, so to build qualitative models of those for biodiversity, local livelihoods, and justice. But I think in this session, we're going to focus on the quantified pieces that we put together, and then discuss a little bit about dynamic baselines, and also talk about how we at the university are engaging with impermanence.
Oh, thanks, Anil. And yeah, that was quite a good introduction, I must say. So I think, so far in the conference, there's been a lot of talk about additionality. But non-permanence in particular, I guess, and durability of carbon projects is something which has not really gotten as much attention. So I'm aware, and I'm sure many people in the audience are aware of many different ways that we can approach impermanence. And when you look at methodologies like Vera's, you obviously need to look at the non-permanence tool, and we can look at historical reversal events in a particular geography. We can also obviously use different climatic models to project forward what we think the potential is, and even forecast using different kind of climate scenarios as well. But now you've launched this permanent additional carbon ton, right? And I think you've just kind of touched on the whole aspect of comparing temporary, or let's say impermanent, nature-based solutions to technology or geological sequestration, right? What kind of spurred you in terms of using the kind of metrics for PACT, and how do you think it could be applied by project developers or corporates going forward?
Okay, that's a big question. So let me break that down into, first of all, what a PACT actually is. So the first question when it comes to engaging with impermanence is trying to figure out what the value of a delayed emission is. So if you have a nature-based solution project, we might delay emissions in old-growth forests by a few decades. If it's tree planting projects, they have their own curve of growth, stabilizing, and then eventual release. But we know that it's nowhere near equivalent to a geological ton. But intuitively, we know that there is a value in impermanent delaying of emissions because it buys us time. And generally speaking, the price of carbon removal will drop over time. So there's got to be a way to quantify that in a more accurate way than simply taking a slice or creating a big buffer zone and trying to sweep it under the carpet. And so our basic approach was building this intuition that there is some value and some discount factor involved in doing something and delaying it for a certain number of years versus it happening immediately. But the problem with the existing mechanisms for doing this is that the results were either picking a time period of, say, 100 years and doing something called ton-year accounting, and this was essentially uneconomic for the projects involved, and also unrealistic, because even in the most conservative release schedules for forests, it's unlikely that they'll be replaced by concrete unless they're fully clear-cut. And even if they're fully clear-cut, it will still take years for a significant forest to be cleared. And so we started building forest models where you can actually model the conservative release schedule of these forests and then figure out from that conservative release schedule what the likely release of this carbon would be over the coming years. And once you have this model based on the knowledge of the local project, you can then start to add up all of the values of the expected releases over the years and come up with a ratio that we called equivalent permanence. And what EP is saying that if you buy a certain number of credits immediately, that is, vertically stack them, then that is equivalent to a geologically sequestered ton of carbon for that project. It gets it off your books because you've purchased a number of these credits up front. And year on year, we reassess the equivalent permanence of the project based on the developments of that particular year, and we readjust it so it's a self-correcting protocol, so that we don't have to select one immediate metric to start with, and as the project gets better and better, its equivalent permanence should rise over the years, resulting in a natural rise of the base price of the project as well. Now, this is a little bit abstract. I can actually show you the table that we put together. We just...
And Anil, sorry, just before you get into the table, because it's an interesting, concept in terms of how we can apply this.
Yep.
There is a concept of vertical stacking, which I'm sure some people might be familiar with, where you do combine multiple projects of different durabilities or non-permanence into one kind of unit, right? And you can offset based on that. Now, can this be used from a vertical stacking perspective? And a lot of the times, the arguments from corporates is it might be quite expensive to do this kind of practice, right? So how can it be applied from a vertical, stacking or horizontal stacking perspective, do you think, as well?
That's a great question. So in the university, we don't want to take on the risk indefinitely of a reversal of a particular a bit of carbon that we're trying to offset. And so in this case, we want to buy everything up front and stack it so that we know that there is some climate benefit immediately caused by some climate harm. For example, the flight from the UK to New York over here. So vertical stacking makes it much simpler for the buyer to just put capital up front and also conveniently invest more in nature-based solution projects immediately than doing horizontal stacking. However, we can also break up our techniques to say that if you're willing to take on the risk year on year of potential reversal of this project, then you can choose to delay the purchase of the equivalently permanent tons up front and then spread that over a number of years. But there, you have to keep track of every ton of carbon that you have emitted and also the eventual addition of all of the tons you buy in the future to make sure that it adds up correctly. So horizontal stacking generally involves more accountancy for the project, and vertical stacking means that you're paying a much steeper price upfront for your ton of carbon, but you know that the climate benefit has been immediately compensated from the climate harm. And to give you a sense of if these numbers work out, well, I paid £150 of offsets for my flight here to New York from the UK, so roughly 2.5 tons of carbon. And this represented around 25 credits in a particular rainforest, a RED Plus project that we have. And this is about a 20% tax in the flight versus if I purchase perhaps some more impermanent credits, I might be paying 2% of the flight cost. And 20% is a highly affordable tax, especially when you're genuinely offsetting the climate harm from the travel, and it feels like a defensible price that we're willing to pay in the university. Obviously, as we roll out this scheme, we'll know for sure if our colleagues all agree, but it's certainly on the right order of magnitude for the current price of carbon, and it feels proportional. So vertical stacking is a good mechanism if the additionality and the permanence calculations work out so that they're in that sweet window of 50 to 100 pounds per ton, and if not, we have to switch to a more of a forward payment model and start horizontally stacking. But so far, vertical stacking is working for the projects we're looking at.
So at Geotree, we look at different kinds of nature-based projects, right? And obviously within forestry, we have RED, ARR, IFM. We look at agriculture as well. So we have regenerative agriculture. Rice methane is a big project area for us. And then also we have grassland management and blue carbon, as people discussed earlier. So do you have an equivalent permanent metric for all of these that could be applied, or how does it work from that perspective? Anyway?
It's a good question. So we separate out the calculation of additionality from permanence. And for additionality, there's obviously lots and lots of different mechanisms based on different methodologies for how to calculate that. For permanence, what we need to do is to calculate the release schedule. And this is the key to the entire technique. If for any of these interventions, you can model what the realistic conservative release schedule is going to be for that particular project, then you can come up with an EP calculation. And this is usually just down to the physical characteristics, any kind of risks such as forest management or any kind of hydrology risks that are emerging from the environment. You can build more and more sophisticated models that more accurately capture the release schedule. You have to do that just once for a certain class of projects, and then you can calculate the expected release schedules fairly easily using available remote sensing data, for example, or climate models or whatever other projection mechanisms we have. It has the advantage that if you get it wrong, it can be self-corrected the next year because we're constantly revising the expected permanence of something on a year-by-year basis as more information comes up to light.
And I think, obviously we live in an exciting time in terms of the data that are available, right? So, as mentioned on the panels earlier, we have optical data, we have SAR data as well in remote sensing. At Geotree, we also have people who are skilled at process modeling. So we can actually model if we plant trees or if we change, farming methods, what are going to be the potential, sequestration or avoidance metrics that could be attributed to that. So with all of those kind of data that are available, obviously, we do have to look at how we're going to process the data. Within our company, every part of the workflow does, incorporate some kind of deep learning method as well. Given that you're based in the computer science department at Cambridge University, how do you see AI and data science actually playing a role, and cloud compute as well, in us being able to scalably look at all of these carbon projects and actually say, okay, on an EP metric or whatever else, this is something which actually does have the climate benefit that we are actually expecting?
That's a great question. It's I think it's a big elephant in the room right now, is that we have lots and lots of excitement, lots of innovation happening by digitizing the way that we calculate some of these metrics, but we have no digital permanence story whatsoever. So one of the huge advantages of, for example, if you take a PDD right now with a lot of narrative baselines, is that you can still read those and interpret those usefully decades down the line. You don't need lots and lots of proprietary information to interpret them. With digital information, now you have got a wealth of really highly motivated, highly intelligent, and highly technological startups that might not be around in 10 years. And if we don't have a mechanism by which we can share the data models, we can actually make sure that they're, for example, escrowed, so they're not revealing their core data, but they will, in the future, be available so that other people can build on them or reproduce them, we're kind of dead in the water, because we can't take a bunch of decisions for projects that will last for 100+ years if we cannot recompute and recalculate that information. So that's actually one of the key things from a research perspective that we're working on in computer science. We're working on a planetary computing engine that can keep data secure and private. It'll let you compute over it, but it'll also enforce explainability, traceability, and reproducibility of that data. And if you can pull all of that off, because no existing system does all of these things simultaneously, then you can actually build something that can survive into the future. And a key part of this is to make sure that no one organization engages in value capture and monopolizes all of that data. So we're using open source and open data methodologies to make sure that if any one org, including Cambridge itself, just disappears, there's sufficient information available in the commons that someone else can reproduce that data and then kind of take up the baton into the future. And once you have this, it makes innovation digitally a safe space, because it means that a startup can attempt to deploy its methodologies, it can evaluate them in the field, and it can have an iterative refinement process to make sure that we can pull all this off. So, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about dynamic baselines and different methodologies to pull all that off. Most of these, ours included, and other people's, use remote sensing data for this. There was a great panel last Tuesday on Counterfactual Tuesdays about comparing a lot of these different mechanisms together. In fact, I think I see Julie in the audience, who is the very representative of that panel. The one thing we do know from this is that there's lots of experimentation and research that still has to happen to converge on what is objectively the right answer for this kind of dynamic baseline calculation. And we need to make sure that we have a forum to do that, and to make sure that whichever one we select can be improved and iterated on in the future. And this is much more abstract than any individual algorithmic selection.
And I think just for those who may not be aware, dynamic baselines, I think Vera's already implemented some in the IFM methodology, and also in the upcoming ARR methodology. I think there's meant to have some kind of dynamic baseline component as well, where essentially you match the project area to control plots elsewhere. And as Anil says, in some cases you can use historical remote sensing data, using what we call spectral temporal similarity, and then obviously whenever you have some kind of monitoring event, assess the project area versus the control plots that you've selected. So I think that's another exciting application where obviously we're using big data sets to try and improve on one of the I guess problem points in the market in terms of baselines, as we've seen, has been a big topic of conversation. So I wonder if there was a table you wanted to show, Anil. So maybe is it worth kind of going through that now so we can have a bit more of a tangible realization of what you've been discussing?
Absolutely, yeah. If we can just show that one. So what we did was we came up with a portfolio of projects, and we wanted a good mix. So we wanted some carbon removal. We wanted to majorly focus on nature-based removal projects. And also, we wanted to make sure that any local projects, such as woodland planting and using Cambridge property, could also be supported as well. So obviously, much less carbon in those projects, but it's local and therefore worth supporting as well. And this table essentially was the first time, I think, that we came up with some numbers that are actually comparable across projects. And what this is showing you, first of all, the first column is the adjusted additionality. So this is us applying dynamic baselines to existing projects and coming up with a ratio that says that this is where we disagree from our baselines from the project narrative. And then just making sure that we account for any extant credits that are already issued, and just doing a one-off additionality adjustment so that we're on the same page. And then we apply our equivalent permanence. So this is saying, this is the ratio by which, given the release schedule for this project, the represents a number of credits we have to buy upfront to vertically stack them. So in the case of the African rainforest conservation one, 0.35 means that you have to buy 1 over 0.35 credits in order to be equivalent to a permanent ton of geologically sequestered carbon. And then you look at in the third column, the baseline price for the project, that is whatever the project itself declares. And then when you adjust all of that together, you come up with the much simpler to consume PACT price, which is what is the price of a permanent additional carbon ton. And in this case, it's interesting because it suddenly puts NBS projects on the same playing field as carbon removal projects. And it shows you that even once you adjust for them using REP calculations, they're still a heck of a lot cheaper than buying Climeworks credits for being equivalently permanent to that project. And it also showed us just how difficult it is, for example, to invest in local projects in Cambridge because the additionality was just so low and the permanence was reasonably high, but it'll just take a very long time. And it let us make portfolio decisions much more easily. And then for the things we can't quantify, we just applied rating style assessments, which is very similar to the information in the current PDDs, except with just stricter guidelines for local livelihoods and so on that just met our requirements. And our hope is, in the future, we can apply similar quantification mechanisms to those ratings. But for now, this is just the stake in the ground where we say that this is what we could reasonably quantify, and then we can iteratively refine this thing as years go on. And so this table was from about 18 months ago, and then now there's many more projects that we've been adding to it and starting to do these assessments. I think the key thing is the application of equivalent permanence across all these in order to have comparable baselines. And we're pretty excited by how this is changing the way that we build portfolios of projects to work with.
No, I think it's, the first time I came across this, to be honest, my mind was a bit blown. Because I think the whole argument that we repeatedly see and hear is about nature versus direct air capture and other kinds of forms of carbon removal that are out there. And to be able to put them on the same playing field, I think is a great kind of tool for us to have. How do we, because PACT really launched, or soft launched, should we say, over the past month. So how do we kind of see it integrating into the current voluntary carbon market ecosystem with players obviously like Vera and the standards and the project developers and everyone else? What's the vision from that perspective, do you think?
So PACT is a metric. And so by metric, it means that it's just something that you can modularize, and as long as you can find a good source of agreed additionality, so you can use that from existing projects from Vera, you can apply your own more experimental baselines like the ones that Cambridge is doing. But the key is to make sure that we can agree on permanence. Because if we can agree on a cross-methodology set of expected release schedules that are realistic and corrected by consensus, then NBS actually has a sectorial play where we can make a claim that our projects are comparable across different jurisdictions and different methodologies, but comparable to carbon removal efforts. And I think this is a theme that's come up repeatedly in the last 2 days of this conference, is that there needs to be consensus built. But my view is that consensus is really vital around permanence, because that's where the nature-based solutions are, I think, most uncertain right now. We're making really good progress on questions of additionality as a community, and that will obviously take some time to settle down. But the consistent application of either vertical or horizontal stacking in a way that permits defensible comparison to geologically sequestered carbon removal projects is vital to make sure that we can scale out to the number of projects that we need. I think in the previous session there was talk about creating an advanced market commitment for buyers, and certainly for the university to be involved in one of these, we'd want permanence to be part of that conversation. Yeah,
I think especially for 800-year-old university, you're probably looking at different timescales as some of the projects that we're looking at here. In terms of, just taking it back to the underlying technology then as well, because I think we had an excellent panel in terms of remote sensing earlier. When it comes to things like biodiversity, because I know you're part of also the Conservation Institute in Cambridge University, do we see any exciting new technology, new sensor capabilities that could come in? I can say at Geotree we're excited about hyperspectral data and applying it to, looking at floral biodiversity especially, but also for soil carbon and other applications. We see, some pretty compelling use cases for that. What are you seeing that could be on the radar coming up that it's worth sharing with the audience?
Yeah, on the radar, I get it. So it's a roller coaster ride with remote sensing. There's satellites going up, there's satellites exploding, there's new sensors going up all the time. But the trend is that the data is only getting richer and richer and richer, and we're limited by our ability to analyze that and adjust for it and to make sure we can integrate that into existing methods. So in terms of the concrete instruments, biomass is going up next year, hopefully. It's a P-band radar that can do forest canopy penetration. Unfortunately, the P-band is also the same area of wavelength as nuclear early warning detection systems, so it's unlikely to cover the whole planet. NATO is blocking it across its areas, but it will almost certainly cover the tropical moist equatorial belt, which will be really, really useful to give us a head start in terms of above ground biomass calculations for those forests and getting through the canopy. Then, in addition to hyperspectral satellites, there's Nmap and there's various data sources there. We're also getting really good at doing on-the-ground deployments, so things like bioacoustics, eDNA, gathering mechanisms. They're all providing really good on-the-ground mechanisms. And one of the areas I'm most excited by is a trend in engineering and computer science to build biodegradable and battery-free sensors. If we can have a breakthrough there, and it looks likely that we will have something in this space in the next 3 to 4 years, is that we can deploy not just a few 100,000 sensors, but trillions of sensors worldwide without causing harm to the planet, and actually start gathering planetary snapshots of what's going on the ground. And obviously we have to solve all kinds of issues like what the back channels are, how these sensors will efficiently get the data back, but those are all highly solvable technological issues that shouldn't take too long. But we do need to start building up these snapshots of what's going on the ground much more systematically and regularly. Right now, they're focused on individual projects where we're deciding there's a focus area, but to get a true view of biodiversity, we need global perspectives from the ground.
Well, I think we're going to have even more data, it seems like, that we need to essentially get some kind of signal from. So, obviously there's a trend we've seen recently in terms of transformers and autoencoders and everything else. How does that relate then to what we see in the carbon market, do you think? And some of the analytics that we want to understand from a kind of, whether it's biomass or carbon or anything else?
So the essential technology behind machine learning is that it's a compressive technology. It tries to, given some sources of variably sparse data, come up with a way of calculating where some interpolated result might be. It can predict intermediate results. And it's most powerful when there's some signal in the noise. And so when you have heterogeneous data sets, then you can start building models that do pretty well at saying that, for example, we have some high-res synthetic aperture radar in one place, but we've got some multispectral or even hyperspectral data at a different resolution, and we want to calculate exactly what a certain result at a point on Earth might be, and it'll interpolate across all of those and give us the answers. Now, the specifics of what machine learning we use is advancing every single day. The big advance right now is foundation models, where how many people here have used ChatGPT or similar? Pretty much everyone has been using it to answer their email, I see. But ChatGPT is an example of a foundation model that is trained in an unsupervised way from huge amounts of data, and then specialized downstream to solve the specific problem of being a chatbot. And you can also train it to do other things. And so this world of building foundation models for remote sensing is a really active research area right now. If we can crack that, if we can build foundation models based on the aggregate information that we're collecting from this growing set of heterogeneous satellites in the sky and indeed on-the-ground results, then it'll be a complete breakthrough of the like we've never seen, because you're building a model, a predictive model of the physical world, and one that can answer questions of topography, of surface temperature, of canopy height, all kinds of things that we do in a bespoke way right now, but you can build one model that can generalize to answering all of those. But you still have all of the problems of digital permanence I talked about. You can't rely solely on machine learning to give you the ground truth. You still need to go back and verify that the result that it guessed for you is accurate. These things are really good at being confidently incorrect. They just sound like they know what they're talking about, and they're wrong. And so you always need to go back to some trusted primary observations that give you a good idea of what that is. And there's movements in the remote sensing space to build quality standards to certify primary data from satellites to make sure we don't never get that mixed up with the results of machine learned data. So we can trust that there was, at that point in time, a physical observation that met these parameters with this particular instrument. So we should never lose sight of the fact that we need that trusted primary source.
Okay, I think Warren is giving me, is that LBW signal there, Warren? So yeah, I think we're running out of time, or we're finished. But anyone have any questions, feel free to grab us later. Anil works with Cambridge University's Center for Carbon Credits. I'm Jon from Geotree. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Appreciate it, thank you.